Shavua Tov. There are four entities in the Bible who come from a distance to engage with the children of Israel, and I wish to focus on these four because they can provide a window of understanding into the reactions of the nations of the world to the current struggle of the state of Israel regarding the Gaza Strip. These four are Amalek, Yitro, Bil'am, and Ruth, much later in the period of the Judges. Two of them are hostile, that would be Amalek and Bil'am. They seem to share three letters of their names together, Ayin, Mem, and Lamed, and they are complementary, as we will see that Amalek comes from an ideological cause, but he expresses it in physical hatred and an attempt to physically destroy the Jewish people, the nation of Israel. Whereas Bilam is the other way around. He comes from a visceral hatred of the Jews, but he doesn't come with a sword. He comes to curse them, so he attempts a spiritual attack. So one comes from a spiritual reason with a physical attack, and the other comes from a physical reason with a spiritual attack. That's an interesting point. We will come back to that in a little bit. The two positive ones are Yitro and Rut. Yitro comes to praise Israel, and Rut comes to join Israel. And by the way, they also have three letters in their name in common, Resh, Vav, and Taf. Coincidence? I don't know, but it certainly helps us to group them. Let's take a look at Yitro. Yitro, since he's in this week's Parsha, he comes because he heard something. What was it that got him up and out of the tent? The rabbis have a discussion. One says it was the splitting of the Red Sea that got him to come. The other one says it was the military defeat of the Amalekites that got him to come. What is this argument about? Perhaps it's whether Yitro was more of a spiritual or physical person. If he was more spiritual and he's interested in God, then the splitting of the sea, that would be right up his alley, because a God that could do that, the splitting of the sea was an action of God, that would impress him. That would get him up and on his way to come and give thanks together with the Israelites. But if he's more of a physical person, well then, the war with Amalek, that was done by the Israelites themselves in physical fashion. They had weapons and swords, and they went and they fought. So that would impress him. The fact that the Israelites were able to defeat such a well-honed army as the Amalekites, that would make him want to come and give thanks and connect again to the nation of Israel. So there is that option as well. But a unique way of combining both of them is expressed by the great Rabbi Dr. Avraham Twersky Zatzal. He says that Yitro, after hearing about the splitting of the sea, was sure that no self-respecting human being with half a brain could doubt the existence of God after that. And then Amalek comes and attacks. How can that be? How come they didn't hear the same thing that he heard? How come they weren't impressed? How come they didn't accept God like he was prepared to do? What's that about? So therefore he, as a seeker, needed to understand better, and he got up and he came. Now Yitro's question is a very good question. How is it that Amalek didn't react to the splitting of the sea with the same way that Yitro did, by embracing faith and admitting there is a God? We discussed this a little bit last week, but it seems to me that Amalek had built their whole Reisen to Etra, their whole identity on their atheistic belief. There is no God, everything must be random. And all of a sudden, this miracle of the splitting of the sea challenges them. So now what do they have to do? They have to prove that it was just a random event. It just so happened that on that particular day there was a tornado in that particular spot that caused the miracle to happen, and it wasn't a miracle at all because there is no God. So therefore they will prove it by coming to physically destroy the Jewish nation. And anybody throughout history that has come to physically destroy the Jewish nation is coming at the urging of the ideology, the atheistic belief of the Amalekites. They want to prove that God does not exist because God put his reputation on the existence of the Jewish nation. And certainly Amalek would feel a need to prevent the revelation at Mount Sinai. Goodness gracious, if the Israelites would hear God speak to them from heaven, that would really prove he exists, especially if it's done not in front of one or two people, but in front of millions. That would really destroy the Amalekite atheistic ideology. They can't let that happen, therefore they had to come and attack, and that was their hostility. Where does Amalek live today? Certainly in the Gaza Strip, hopefully only for a few more days. Amalek exists wherever there is this kind of hatred based on an ideology that they feel that the existence of Israel threatens in an existential manner. And it manifests it in such a cruel and barbaric hatred that we have to fight and defend against. So that's the first response that we need to know about. The Amalekite response, and we need to be prepared to fight back against it. Then you have Bilam. If we're on the hostiles, we'll go to Bilam. Bilam comes with a different set of tools. He has a visceral, physical hatred of Jews, but he doesn't have a problem with God. After all, he's a prophet of God. He speaks to God on a regular basis. He just doesn't want Jews in his neighborhood. May the Lord bless and keep the Jews, or I should say curse and keep the Jews according to him, far away from us, to paraphrase from Fiddler on the Roof. But he comes using a spiritual method of cursing because, after all, he is a prophet. And this is, I think, also something we see in the world today. Those who come and to curse Israel, they say that Israel is immoral, it's committing genocide, it is doing all kinds of terrible, terrible things. They're not saying it because they really believe it, they're saying it because they have a visceral hatred of Jews, and I believe that Bilam today resides in the government offices of South Africa. But what about Yitro and Root? Who are they? Yitro, he's got a certain hesitation when it comes to the Jewish nation. He does not join us as Ruth does. What is it that blocks him? It's not clear, but he's willing to come up to a certain point. He's in favor, he blesses God, but there's always a hesitation. When the Torah says, Vayichad Yitro, he rejoiced, the Rashi says, yes, he rejoiced, but he also learns out from that word vayichad that his skin became chadudim. He broke out in hives. In other words, he had a negative reaction to it. Something bothered him about Israel's success. The drowning of the Egyptians perhaps bothered him. The killing of the Amalekites perhaps bothered him. He was still somewhat hesitant, and he remained on the fence. And I can understand the drowning of the Egyptians bothering him because, after all, we Jews do the same thing. When we have our Seder Pesach, we spill some of the drops of wine by the 10 plagues because the suffering of the human beings, of the Egyptians, even though it was necessary and deserved, still diminishes our joy. So Yitro probably had that same reaction, maybe a little stronger. So he's willing to support Israel, but up to a point. There comes a point when the suffering is a little too much for him and he may pause. Where does Yitro live today? I believe he lives in Washington, D.C. These are people that are supportive of Israel. They understand what our fight is about. But at some point, they may return to their place. And Israel needs to be prepared, as the Bnei Israel, after Yitro left, continued in the desert on their own without his guiding eyes. And that is what Moshe says to Yitro. He asks him, please stay, you're our guiding eyes. And Yitro says, sorry, I can't. And he leaves, according to most commentaries. There's one commentary that says that Yitro did stay. But we understand this. And we're grateful for the support that we receive, even up to the point where it is no longer as strong as it was. Because Yitro himself is praised in the Torah. The Parsha, where the Torah is given, where the 10 Commandments are given, is called Parshat Yitro. So we understand that, and we are grateful for that. But the champion and winner is definitely Ruth, because Ruth, despite the opposition, she's being told by her mother-in-law, you don't have to, stay where you are. Why should you have such a hard life? She insists, your God is my God, your people is my people, your land is my land, wherever you go, I shall go. That is Ruth. She represents the embrace. You know, it's an amazing thing that many soldiers, when the war broke out, wanted to get tzitzit, ritual fringes. Even secular ones wanted tzitzit. Fascinating. You have images and pictures of yeshiva boys tying tzitzit to send them to the soldiers. I was in a restaurant here in my town, and behind the counter there were a couple of young men in their 20s, no yarmulke, no kippah, didn't appear to be religious at all, but they both were wearing tzitzit, and one of them had tzitzit with techelet, with the sky blue, which is even more fancy version, as it were. What is it about tzitzit? I believe that tzitzit is the embrace. If we go back to Amalek, we discussed last week that Amalek's whole idea is that the whole world is not unified, but rather it is random. So Amalek therefore becomes the great divider, the great sower of hatred and conflict. Well, the The number 9, as we discussed, is a very divisible number, and that is Amalek. He wishes to divide and cause dissent and suffering throughout the world because of his ideology. Well, what's the answer to that? To get to the number 10, which is taking all of the multiple assets of creation and embracing them. And that's the key word, embracing. Ruth embraces the Jewish nation. She doesn't, like Yitro, come to a point and have an intellectual support, but can't go all the way. Ruth comes all the way. She represents the embrace, and I believe that that's what tzitzit is also. It's an embrace. It's worn in a garment that covers our entire being. And that embrace, and I believe that when the terrorists in Gaza attacked us, they attacked us because we're Jews. And the soldiers who wished to have tzitzit were basically saying, well, if that's the case, I want to be more Jewish, and I'm going to wear this uniquely Jewish garment, which identifies me as a Jew. And that is the embrace that we need. Because Amalek comes to divide, we respond with an embrace, and that is what will eventually win at the end of the day. Sheyeh Shavua Tov, a good week with good news for all of us.